That fragile voice belonged to a child captured on her grandmother's phone in 2020. Within months, that voice would never be heard again. Her final journey was not sudden. It stretched over weeks of abuse and ended in a slow, agonizing collapse on the kitchen floor. Julissia pleaded for help, but the one person who should have defended her, her own mother, stood idly by, focused on inventing lies for doctors instead of saving her child's life. Yet Julissia did not accept the role of victim. She searched instinctively for safety, reaching out in desperation to those who loved her. She clung to hope with the resilience only a child could possess, but the adult world failed her. Her cries were overlooked, her signals brushed aside, until she became another name on the long list of tragedies that should have been prevented. Her case stands as one of cruelty and neglect at its most extreme. In just 7 short years, she endured what no child should: violence, betrayal, and a justice system that let her down. When the courts allowed her mother a minimal sentence and enabled her abuser to walk free, it mocked the very idea of justice. Before moving further into this painful story, I must ask something of you. Share this story, comment, subscribe. Each time the story spreads, another set of eyes may catch signs of danger in a child's life. Silence costs lives. Awareness can save them. April 26, 2014, Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. That's where Julissia Batties entered the world. Only 5 days later, she was taken away from her mother, Julissia Jones. Authorities had already removed 5 of Jones's children due to abuse. Instead, newborn Julissia went into the arms of her grandmother, Yolanda Davis, who carried her directly from the maternity ward into her home. Her father, Julissia Batties, longed to raise her, but Jones fought him every step, filing false claims of domestic violence. Investigations showed no wrongdoing, and Julius had no criminal record. Still, each fabricated accusation created more distance between him and his little girl. The system, against all reason, chose to believe the mother who had already lost 5 children instead of the father who had none of these stains on his record. Under Yolanda's roof, Julissia blossomed. Her grandmother devoted herself to raising her, pouring all her love and energy into the child's well-being. For Yolanda, her granddaughter was life's treasure, her reason for being. By toddlerhood, Julissia was a picture of joy. She had round cheeks, curious eyes, and arms eager for hugs. Laughter filled that Brooklyn apartment. She was sharp for her age, already reciting letters, counting numbers, pointing out colors. Above all, she wanted to be close to her grandmother. Even when neighborhood children played outside, she often chose to stay indoors, waiting for the moments when it would just be the 2 of them. She danced, she sang, and she loved copying TikTok clips. Frozen was her favorite movie, and she would greet visitors at the door with Elsa and Anna dolls clutched proudly in her hands. Her bond with her father was equally powerful, though it existed only in fragments. Limited to weekend visits because of her mother's false accusations, their time together became sacred. With him, Julissia glowed. She wore his cap proudly, pulled silly faces for his camera, and savored happy meals as if they were grand feasts. For her, those weekends were like stepping into a holiday. Evenings often ended with FaceTime calls, a cherished ritual. Father and daughter whispered secrets, laughed at nonsense, and counted down the days until their next visit. For Julius, those calls were proof that her spirit was still shining, no matter what obstacles were placed between them. In school, she was adored. Wearing her uniform and Paw Patrol backpack, she stepped into the classroom eager to learn. She was polite, thoughtful, and quick to help younger classmates. Teachers described her as a child with limitless potential, but shadows lurked. There was one thing that dimmed her light: visits with her biological mother. During those encounters, her cheerfulness evaporated. Anxiety and fear took its place. And then, in 2017, as she turned 3 years old, a critical turning point arrived.
AS ruled that Yolanda Davis, the grandmother, had broken protocol by allowing Julius, the father, to spend time with his daughter unsupervised. As punishment, the authorities removed Julissia from the only safe home she had known. For a while, the child was stripped from the grandmother's arms. But after review, the caseworkers reversed the decision. By 2018, Julissia was back where she belonged, at Yolanda's side. It was at this point that the system decided to escalate contact with her biological mother. At first, the meetings took place under supervision within the walls of the agency's office. Even in that controlled environment, psychologists noticed something alarming. The little girl cowered in corners, wept uncontrollably, and begged not to be sent near her mother. In one therapy session, she said clearly, "I don't want to go to Mom," but her words fell on deaf ears. Despite documented fear, officials expanded the visits to her mother's apartment on weekends. That decision marked the beginning of the nightmare. Every time a visit loomed, panic overwhelmed her. Her grandmother recalled how the girl would retreat into corners of the apartment, trembling, while Yolanda herself wept, powerless. "You don't see this. This is a red flag," she pleaded. Yet the caseworker's answer never changed. "I know, but she has to see her mom." No one believed that a child could fear her mother so deeply, so Yolanda began recording the conversations, hard evidence of terror in her granddaughter's voice. In one of these recordings, Julissia tried to explain what happened inside that apartment. She described fights among her older brothers, one so violent it left the youngest bleeding. When pressed to explain further, all she could whisper was, "Something bad." In April 2018, the girl, only 4 years old, told her grandmother words that should have shattered every illusion of safety. "Mom hit me with a hammer." Coming from a child so young, those words should have stopped the visits immediately. But they did not. The push for reunification continued. At times, Yolanda asked gently, "What is wrong at Mummy's house that you done to want to go?" The child's reply was silence. Not the silence of disobedience, but the silence of fear, knowledge too dangerous for her to speak aloud. By 2019, the mother, Julissia Jones, had given birth to another son. Authorities considered this a sign of rehabilitation. Since the infant was not removed from her custody, the narrative became one of supposed reform. This opened the path for the next step, Julissia's return. The illusion deepened in 2020. One of the older sons, Paul Fine Jr., came back to live with Julissia. He was the same teenager who would later admit to relentlessly beating Julissia. But officials saw it differently. If a previously unfit mother could now care for both a baby and a teenager, then surely she had changed. So when March 2020 arrived and the pandemic reshaped the world, the system made a devastating choice. That spring, Yolanda reluctantly brought Julissia for what was supposed to be a weekend visit with her mother at the Mitchell houses in the Bronx. 2 days stretched into weeks. Weeks turned into months. That brief stay became a death sentence. When Yolanda demanded answers, she recorded the ACS worker's candid admission. "They probably want to close this case." Outraged, she argued, "The child is terrified of her mother." The reply came flat, bureaucratic, detached. "I know, but she has to see her mum." The father, Julius, also raised his voice, warning repeatedly of the danger. But by then, his credibility had been undermined by years of false allegations. His warnings carried no weight. On June 21, 2021, the court sealed the child's fate. Custody was officially transferred to her mother. From that day forward, Julissia was trapped in a 10th-floor apartment at the Mitchell houses. Her new reality, a mother, an infant sibling, and a 17-year-old half-brother, Paul Fine Jr. The apartment reeked of cigarettes and stale food. Piles of clothes and broken furniture filled the space. It was the very opposite of the warm, tidy home where her grandmother hung her drawings and school awards. Within days, the truth became clear. She was no longer the princess in pretty dresses. She was no longer the child cherished by her grandmother. In that apartment, she became a servant, and worse, a target. Paul began with petty cruelties, snatching her food, shoving her into walls, mocking her. She turned to her mother for protection, but Julissia shouted back, "Stop lying, Paul is your brother." The mother not only ignored her cries, she punished her for daring to complain. Soon, Paul's cruelty escalated. Punches rained down when she tried to eat without permission. Kicks landed when she cried too loudly. Shoves came whenever she dared disturb him, While he watched television, Paul realized quickly that his younger sister was defenseless. To him, she became a toy, a victim available at will. From then on, Julissia lived not in a home, but in a prison of constant fear. The blows did not come only from Paul. Slaps from her mother and jabs from her brother rained down whenever she made the smallest mistake. Even when there was no direct assault, the bright little girl who once radiated joy faded. Her wide eyes, once full of curiosity, now carried only emptiness and the defeated gaze of a child who had surrendered. Neighbors began to notice. They saw her wandering the streets alone, a 7-year-old crossing the chaotic lanes of East 138th Street without an adult, clutching a food stamp card in her small hand. One store worker, Ernie Slade, could never forget the image, a fragile figure in a pink mask. A fresh bruise beneath one eye, hands trembling so violently she could hardly pass the card across the counter. Later he would confess his regret. I should have taken her straight to the police. But like so many others, he stayed silent, and silence cost her everything. This is not a rare story. It happens in thousands of homes every single day, which is why these stories must be shared. Perhaps if one more person had spoken, Julissia's ending could have been different. The last FaceTime call with her father was almost unbearable. Julius tried to smile, tried to reassure, but his instincts told him something was deeply wrong. On the screen, his daughter forced a grin. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm okay, Daddy. I love you. You're the best, Dad." Julius replayed that call over and over in his mind, never knowing those words would be among her last. The signs were everywhere. Grandmother Yolanda called caseworkers again and again. Neighbors lodged complaints. Julius demanded investigations. Even strangers like the store clerk saw the danger. But the system chose not to see, not to hear. By August, the mask could no longer cover the violence. Bruises and black eyes became impossible to hide. One day a neighbor asked who had hit her. Trembling, the little girl whispered a single word, "Mommy." It was the final chance for adults to intervene. Yolanda, desperate, reported it once again to Child Protective Services, hoping against hope that this time someone would listen. When the social worker arrived, Invesia had her excuse ready. The injury, she claimed, came from an accident. Just a toy water gun, nothing more. She smiled as she delivered the lie. Julissia stood beside her, head lowered, too frightened to raise her eyes. The worker did not even speak to the child privately. When the door closed behind them, the mask fell from Nevesia's face. She hissed to her daughter, "You see what happens when you open your mouth?" Julissia understood all too well. Things would only get worse. On August 7th, neighbor Michael Roberts saw them in the building elevator. He noticed the oddest detail. Julissia wore sunglasses, even though the day was overcast and they were indoors. She stared at the floor, unmoving, detached. Behind those glasses, hidden from casual glances, were yesterday's bruises layered with fresh ones. Paul had spent the morning teaching his sister with his fists. It would be her last walk in public. By then, both mother and son knew the bruises could no longer be concealed. Paul's violence escalated further. Perhaps he had no calculated plan to kill, but the intoxication of power over a helpless victim drove him. On August 8th and 9th, his assaults grew systematic. He pummeled her face, drove his fists into her stomach and back, struck her head again and again. She tried to curl into a ball, hands over her face, but she was a child against a young man already growing into adult strength. She had no chance. On the morning of August 10th, 2021, hunger woke her before dawn. Her stomach cramped with pain. The night before, she had been denied food as punishment. Quietly, she slipped from her bed and crept into the kitchen. She knew the rules. Never touch food without permission. But the ache inside was too sharp. She opened the refrigerator. The sound woke Paul. He saw his sister, a 7-year-old child, standing with food in her hands. For him, that was enough. The first punch landed square on her face, so powerful that the outline of his fist was left imprinted on her cheek. A second blow. A third. She collapsed, arms raised desperately to shield herself. He did not stop. 8 times his knuckles smashed into her face, leaving 8 distinct marks on skin that should have known only kisses and laughter. But that was not the worst. Paul's foot swung forward, driving into her stomach with full force, as if trying to kick through a wall. The sound was sickening. A hollow burst, like air exploding from a ruptured ball. Inside her tiny body, organs tore, liver, spleen, intestines shredded. Blood began flooding her abdominal cavity. Julissia crumpled, writhing on the floor, nails scratching against the linoleum as shock overtook her body. Vomit mixed with blood filled her mouth. Her skin grew pale and clammy. Her pupils widened with pain. Every convulsion pulled her closer to the end. She was 7 years old. 7. And in those final hours she suffered injuries so catastrophic that even adults would not have survived. And still her torment was not yet over. Julissia lay sprawled across the kitchen floor, her body seizing in violent spasms. Tiny fingernails scratched the filthy linoleum as her insides ruptured. Blood filled her stomach cavity, organ after organ shutting down under the damage. She vomited, her breath shallow, her lips flecked with red. Her skin lost its warmth, turning pale and waxy, while her pupils widened until they reflected only pain and shock. And in those last unbearable hours, as the child lay dying, Paul Fine Jr. descended to the most unspeakable cruelty. He raped his 7-year-old sister as her life ebbed away. Later, the autopsy would confirm the horror. The sexual assault happened after the fatal abdominal injuries had already sealed her fate. For 3 long hours, Julissia suffered. For 3 long hours, her mother and Julissia Jones stood in the same room. She did nothing to save her daughter. She did not call for help. She did not cradle her. Instead, she thought only of what lies she might tell once the inevitable came. Only when it was obvious the child was slipping beyond return did she finally rush to a neighbor's door, screaming, "Help! My daughter stopped breathing." But by then, it was far too late. This was the same little girl who had once pleaded with her grandmother to call the police, and no one had listened. When paramedics arrived, the scene was devastating. Julissia's body temperature had fallen to 96.6 degrees Celsius. Her pupils were fixed and dilated, unresponsive to light. Distinct outlines of fists were visible across her face. Bruises stained her body from head to toe. Inside, blood filled her abdomen, the result of ruptured organs. The autopsy would later confirm what was already evident. She had been sexually assaulted as her body shut down. Doctors at Lincoln Hospital fought to save her. For an hour, they tried every measure, but the damage was irreversible. At 9:06 a.m. on August 10, 2021, the little girl's heart stopped. She died not in her grandmother's arms, not in the safety of her father's presence, but surrounded by strangers. Meanwhile, Julissia spun a story for police. She said her daughter had woken early, complained of stomach pain, then vomited and urinated before falling and striking her head on a desk. She painted the picture of a tragic household accident. But even after the arrests, justice was warped into mockery. Before her killers even faced trial, the family endured yet another cruelty. Julissia Jones, the very woman who had allowed and participated in her daughter's torment, demanded the right to organize the funeral. Grandmother Yolanda, who had raised and cherished Julissia for 6 years, was barred from claiming her granddaughter's body. For weeks, the child's body lay in the morgue, while adults fought over legal rights. On November 1, 2021, nearly 3 months after her death, she was finally buried at John S. Funeral Home in East New York, Brooklyn. Julius, her father, wore a purple t-shirt printed with her picture. He bent over the closed casket, sobbing as he said goodbye. The betrayal did not end there. In March 2025, 4 years after the crime, Julissia accepted a plea deal. She pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter, and in return, Paul Fine Jr., the same teenager who had savagely beaten and raped his dying sister, was freed. He walked out smiling, dressed in an orange jacket and fresh Jordan sneakers, showing no remorse. When the time for sentencing arrived, Julissia twice refused to face the court. In May, she claimed the press made her presence impossible. In June, she stormed into the courtroom, screaming, "I don't want to hear what they have to say." And so, even in death, Julissia was denied justice. A child was buried, her killers shielded by loopholes, her memory left to those who had tried to save her and were silenced at every turn. When the time came for the father and grandmother to deliver their victim impact statements, the killer made her disdain clear. "Okay, but that doesn't mean I have to listen to them," she sneered. forcing the judge to demand her presence in court. On June 23, 2025, Julissia Jones was sentenced to just 17 years in prison, barely 2.5 years for every year her daughter lived. With good behavior, she could walk free at age 56 and begin again. Julissia would never be given that chance. At the sentencing, Julissia Batties clutched a pendant holding his daughter's photograph. He remembered her final words with agonizing clarity. "I love you. You're the best dad." Those words replayed endlessly in his mind, burned into his memory as both comfort and torment. In the lobby of the Mitchell houses, the building where Julissia spent her last months in torment, a humble memorial still stands. Candles, flowers, and a Minnie Mouse doll rest there, left for the little girl who adored Disney and dreamed of one day being a princess. 2 years after her death in October 2023, Julius finally gained full custody of his young son. But even in that joy there was sorrow. The boy, only 4 years old, often asked about his sister. "I miss her. I want to give her a hug and a kiss," he said, a child's longing too heavy for his years. Julissia Batties' life was short, just 7 years, but in that time she radiated warmth to those who truly loved her. She was the child who greeted guests with Elsa and Anna dolls in her hands, who wore her father's cap with pride, who called her grandmother her best friend. She laughed at silly jokes, made weekend plans with excitement, and believed, perhaps too much, in the kindness of adults. For 6 years, her laughter filled her grandmother's home, her smile lighting every corner. Her hugs, her songs, her dances were gifts to those around her. Now she is gone. Rest in peace, Pumpkin. By April 2025, she should have been celebrating her 15th birthday. Instead, balloons were released into the sky, symbols of a life stolen and dreams that would never come true. The tragedy deepened further with bitter irony. The man who had tormented her, her abuser, served only 2.5 years in prison before walking free. His godmother had been an inspector at DCFS, the very agency that had ignored report after report, 10 separate chances to save this little girl. Each one dismissed, each one a missed opportunity. This was the story of a modern-day Cinderella, though her fairy tale was twisted into a nightmare. Her beautiful dresses gave way to old, stained t-shirts. Her pretty hairstyles were replaced with harsh cuts. Her beloved dolls were taken from her hands and replaced with constant fear and suffering. No fairy godmother appeared. No prince arrived to rescue her. This Cinderella never saw her happy ending. The system that was supposed to shield her did worse than fail. It turned away, plugging its ears, closing its eyes. Friends, before we go further, I ask you, share this story, subscribe, comment with your city and time. Every interaction spreads awareness. Every voice may help another child whose cries are being ignored right now. If these stories are heard, maybe the next child can be saved. On April 16, 2010, in St. Joseph's Hospital in Bloomington, Illinois, another little princess entered the world. Her name was Rika Roundtree, the daughter of Richard James Roundtree, and Antoinette Ann Beasley, later Simmons. She was the only girl among her brothers, and from the moment she arrived, she became the jewel of her mother's heart. In those first years, Rika, known as Ra, was cherished. Anne poured herself into her daughter, creating a world of warmth, magic, and love. Ra's hair was always adorned with bright clips and colorful ribbons, chosen carefully by her mother. She wore dresses that shimmered with color and joy. Anne even had tiny matching gowns made for Ra's dolls so that they could dress alike. Ra adored her dolls. With her mother, she visited yard sales, hunting for toy strollers, car seats, bottles, and clothes. She even asked for real diapers for her dolls, treating them as her children. She nurtured them with a seriousness far beyond her years, proof of her enormous heart and her capacity to love. The Roundtree home was filled with laughter and the sounds of childhood. For Ra, each day was a fairy tale. She fell asleep to princess stories whispered by her mother, waking with a smile, ready to play with her dolls or her brothers. But fairy tales do not last forever, and despite the hardships that loomed over the family, Anne tried her best to keep magic alive for her daughter. She created little celebrations, small rituals of joy, so Ra's days could still sparkle. But the storm clouds gathered. The marriage between Richard and Anne began to collapse, and the fragile fairy tale they had built together started to fracture. The tension inside the Roundtree family reached a breaking point. Frequent arguments between Richard and Anne often turned violent, drawing the attention of Child Protective Services. DCFS visited their home on multiple occasions, yet each time the investigations were closed with the conclusion that the situation wasn't serious enough to warrant intervention. The warnings were ignored. By the end of 2015, the marriage crumbled. Richard and Anne divorced, leaving Anne to care for 5 children on her own. The weight of single motherhood quickly became overwhelming. She began drinking heavily, and one night in December, her drinking ended in disaster. She was arrested for drunk driving after a serious accident. Life spiraled downward. She lost her job at a financial institution, and with bills piling up and children to feed, Anne made a fatal mistake. Desperation pushed her to begin selling illegal substances. In September 2016, she was arrested again, this time sentenced to jail. For her daughter Ra, only 6 years old, the fairy tale ended abruptly. With Anne behind bars, custody of Ra fell to Richard. By then, he was living with a new girlfriend, Cynthia Marie Baker. She had a dark past, a history of violence and cruelty, but social services overlooked it. Their decision to place Ra in that home would mark the beginning of her descent into terror. From the first days, Ra sensed she was no longer safe. The home felt nothing like her mother's. The smell of cookies was gone, the cheerful music silenced, the cozy corner where she once played replaced by cold hostility. Cynthia immediately divided the household with 2 sets of rules, one for her biological children and another for Ra. When Cynthia's kids ate eggs and bacon for breakfast, Ra was given a piece of dry bread. When they went to amusement parks, Ra stayed home, scrubbing floors. At Christmas, Cynthia's children received stockings full of gifts, while Ray's held only a few pencils. "I don't want anything to do with her," Richard spat, his voice cold and final. "I don't want to pay child support. I don't want visits. I don't want to be her father. I just want her adopted out." With those words, he abandoned his daughter in spirit, long before she would be abandoned in life. At school, the warning signs were undeniable. Teachers noticed Ra arriving without a winter coat in the freezing Illinois cold. One teacher, moved by compassion, organized a small collection and purchased a warm coat for the girl. For Ra, it was a rare gesture of kindness. For Cynthia, it was an insult. The very next day, she stormed into the school, accusing staff of favoritism, claiming her own daughter was overlooked. Soon after, Ra vanished from class for 2 days. When she returned on December 10th, her tiny face was marked with 2 black eyes and a bruise spreading across her cheek. Staff at Fox Creek Elementary immediately reported the injuries to DCFS. The following day, Child Protection Specialist Patricia Shannon met with Ra. When asked, the child whispered that she had fallen while packing toys in a closet 3 days earlier. Principal Lizzie Davenport later testified that this was not the first injury she had not. Despite these mounting concerns, Shannon spent less than an hour inside Richard and Cynthia's home. Her follow-up was a single phone call, during which she advised them to take Ra to a doctor. Richard dismissed the idea, claiming he couldn't afford the emergency room fee of $200. Hours later, he relented, saying he would take her to a clinic in Pontiac. The doctor there accepted the parents' explanations, noted their story as credible, and ordered an X-ray that was never carried out. By December 20th, DCFS officially sided with Shannon's unfounded finding against Cynthia. The new year brought no relief. January 2019 began with the familiar chill of an Illinois winter, but for Ra, it would be her final month alive. In the days leading to her death, the cruelty intensified. Cynthia's disdain grew sharper, her punishments harsher. Ra complained constantly of stabbing pains in her stomach. She vomited often and could barely eat. Her small frame grew weaker by the day. To Cynthia, it was nothing but another performance, another trick for attention. To anyone else, it should have been a blaring alarm. Neighbors and relatives would later recall how the child stumbled as she walked, her vision failing, her movements clumsy. Videos recovered from Cynthia's phone would reveal the horrifying reality. Ra, only 8 years old, barely able to stand, forced to complete chores while her stepmother's voice berated her. "Faster! You're doing this on purpose!" Cynthia shouted as the child struggled to lift objects far too heavy for her frail frame. By January 25, 2019, Ra's condition collapsed entirely. She lost consciousness, and an ambulance rushed her to Bronx Medical Center. Doctors there were horrified. How had this child been left untreated for so long? Her body bore signs of prolonged abuse, including a large, dark bruise across her stomach. She was immediately transferred to OSF St. Francis Hospital for emergency surgery. Surgeons fought desperately to save her life, opening her abdomen to stem the internal bleeding. But the damage was irreversible. On January 26, 2019, 8-year-old Roundtree died on the operating table. That night, investigators confronted Richard and Cynthia. Both denied responsibility. Cynthia insisted she hadn't sought medical help sooner because the girl always pretended to be sick. News of Ra's death reached Anne, her mother, in the most brutal way imaginable. She was barely 3 weeks into a prison sentence when she was summoned to the Chaplain ES office. There by phone she was told her only daughter was gone. There was no funeral, no obituary. Richard and Cynthia had Ra's body cremated almost immediately, erasing the chance for her mother to say goodbye. But the truth could not be erased. The autopsy painted a picture of systematic torture. Detectives uncovered videos stored in Cynthia's iCloud, shocking evidence of abuse captured by her own hand. Cynthia was no stranger to DCFS. In 2002, she had been accused of harming a stepchild, and again in 2012 for injuring her own daughter. In April 2019, Cynthia Baker, aged 41, was charged with first-degree murder and multiple counts of domestic battery. Prosecutors accused her of delivering the fatal kick to Ra's stomach. Dr. Matthew Fox, who conducted the autopsy, testified that Ray's body carried 67 scars and bruises. The cause of death was peritonitis from blunt force trauma, a ruptured intestine that flooded her abdomen with blood. Her final days, he confirmed, were filled with unbearable pain. Forensic pathologist Dr. Scott Denton described the child's body as a crime scene. Pediatric surgeon Dr. Charles Abraham, who had fought in vain to save her in the operating room, testified that the fatal injuries had been inflicted 3 to 5 days before hospitalization. If Ra had been brought in immediately, he stated, she could have been saved, but no one had brought her. At trial, the truth could no longer be hidden. Cynthia's own children testified against her, describing the horrors they had witnessed. Her 6-year-old daughter told the jury how she saw her mother kick Ra in the stomach over and over, laughing at her cries of pain. Her teenage son testified that Ra often complained of hunger, that she went to bed night after night with an empty stomach. Ra's teacher took the stand, describing a bright, energetic girl whose spark slowly faded. She said Ra began to move like an old woman trapped in a child's body, her gait stiff, her energy drained. The courtroom fell silent as text messages were presented, exchanges between Cynthia and Richard, in which the abuse was discussed almost casually. In one, Cynthia admitted that Ra had spent an entire day crying. Then came the most damning evidence of all, Cynthia's own home videos. The jury watched, horrified, as footage showed her dragging Ra by the neck into a bedroom. In the recording, the girl, naked, terrified, was forced to hold cans in her hands while Cynthia slapped her ears and face. "Do I need a collar for you?" Cynthia mocked before grabbing the child by the throat. The video lasted 23 agonizing minutes. Another recording showed Cynthia kneeing Ra repeatedly in the back as she screamed in agony. The person holding the camera, silently watching and doing nothing, was her father, Richard Roundtree. On November 19, 2019, the verdict was delivered. Cynthia Baker was found guilty of first-degree murder and several related charges. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the story did not end there. Cynthia's sister, Victoria Baker, was charged with harassment after delivering a letter from Cynthia to Richard, urging him to take the blame for Ra's death. Victoria was sentenced to 30 months of probation. Then, on January 7, 2020, Richard Roundtree himself was arrested. Documents revealed that Illinois DCFS had found him responsible for his daughter's death through neglect and abuse. The charges included endangerment of the life and health of a child. In February 2020, Richard pleaded guilty to child endangerment and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Anne, Ra's mother, stood in court and addressed him directly. "Whatever the sentence is, it will never be enough. Ra was 8 years old and you were her father. You were supposed to protect her from pain. I feel like you deserve to die in prison." Richard's only response was a hollow apology. "I should have protected her better, and I'm sorry." In January 2020, neighbors and friends gathered in front of the Roundtree home. They released hundreds of balloons in Ra's favorite color into the winter sky, honoring the little girl whose life had been stolen. On April 17, 2021, Anne organized a day of play to celebrate what would have been Ra's 11th birthday. Children played games, listened to music, and laughed, exactly the way Ra would have wanted. Anne hoped to make it an annual tradition, transforming grief into a celebration of her daughter's short life. But even this semblance of justice was undermined. On October 6, 2022, Richard Roundtree walked free. Despite an 8-year sentence, he had served only 2.5 years before being released on parole. Ra became one of over 100 children in Illinois who died within a year of having contact with DCFS in 2018 and 2019. After her death, an internal review was conducted, involving 6 DCFS employees. Yet the outcome was bitterly ironic. Patricia Shannon, the caseworker who had dismissed so many warnings, not only avoided punishment, but was promoted with a raise of $20,000. Ra's story is not just about one family. It is about a system that looked away again and again until a little girl's body could no longer endure the abuse. Her case is a call to action, a demand for reform in child protection services, and for society to take signs of abuse with the seriousness they deserve. We should remember Ra not only as a victim, but as a child with a loving heart who wanted nothing more than to be cherished and safe. This modern Cinderella never saw her happy ending, but perhaps her story can prevent another child from meeting the same fate. Rest in peace, Ra. You will not be forgotten. To all of you who have watched this story through to the end, thank you. Awareness saves lives, and every voice matters. The story of Julissia Batties and Ra Roundtree is more than tragedy. It is an indictment. 2 little girls living hundreds of miles apart shared the same fate, abandoned by the very adults who should have cherished them and betrayed by systems that were meant to protect. Julissia's life was 7 years short, her final hours marked by unimaginable suffering. Ra's lasted 8, cut down by cruelty that stole her childhood piece by piece. Both were failed not just by parents, but by agencies that closed files too soon, by neighbors who stayed silent, by communities that turned away from the signs. And yet, their voices remain. In the recordings where Julissia begs not to be sent back to her mother, in the testimony of Ra's teachers, who described a child fading before their eyes, these echoes are all that's left to remind us of the urgency we must carry forward. We must do more than remember. We must demand change. Cases like these are not rare anomalies. They are warnings. The cracks in the system that swallowed Julissia and Ra are still open today, waiting to claim another child. Reform cannot be a slogan. It must be policy, practice, and accountability. Every report of abuse must be taken seriously. Every child deserves an advocate who will not stop speaking until they are safe. To those who feel helpless in the face of stories like this, remember, silence is complicity. Speak up when you see warning signs. Share these stories, even when they are painful. Because awareness can be the difference between a child hidden in shadows and a child rescued into safety. And to the memory of Julissia and Ra, we honor you. Your short lives, though scarred by cruelty, held beauty and light that touched those who truly knew you. Your laughter, your love of dolls and cartoons, your dreams of being princesses, these will not be forgotten. You deserved futures filled with birthdays, adventures, and love. You deserved fairy tales that ended in joy, not nightmares that ended in morgues. Rest in peace, Julissia. Rest in peace, Ra. May your stories awaken the conscience of everyone who hears them. Friends, if this story has moved you, I ask for your voice in return. Leave a comment below, share where you're watching from, share your thoughts, and let others know these children's names. And if you wish to support this channel's work, every share, every like, every donation helps us continue uncovering and telling these stories with the depth and respect they deserve. Your support keeps this work alive. Thank you truly for standing with us, for giving these stories the attention they deserve, and for helping keep alive the memory of those who could not be saved. Together, maybe we can make sure fewer children suffer the same fate.